The folder slid across the coffee table and stopped in front of my brother's knees. Not mine. My father didn't look at me when he said it. I think it's time Caleb takes over. My chest went tight like the air had been sucked out of the living room. The house was quiet except for the grandfather clock ticking on the wall, each second loud, deliberate, humiliating. My brother reached for the folder immediately, fingers confident, already familiar with paper he hadn't earned. I felt my hand clamp harder around my glass of water to keep it from shaking. No discussion. No warning. No thank you. Just gone. 7 years of my life handed to someone who'd barely worked 7 months. The business I'd built from nothing, reduced to a leather folder sliding across polished wood. My father finally looked at me, and expected me to smile. Smiled. A thin, practiced thing that burned my face as it settled into place. My father nodded approvingly, like I'd passed some invisible test of femininity and grace. My mother stared at the coffee table, adjusting coasters that didn't need fixing, playing her usual role of silent witness. Family should support each other, my father added, his voice carrying that tone he used when he wanted something to sound final, unchallengeable. Caleb didn't even look at me. He was already flipping pages, nodding at numbers he'd never tracked, strategies he'd never built, client relationships he'd never nurtured. That's when it hit me. This conversation had never been for me. This was an announcement, not a discussion. They'd decided weeks ago. Maybe months. The folder was just theater, a prop in a play where I hadn't been given a script. I stood up before they could see my eyes betray me. I grabbed my bag and walked toward the front door with measured steps. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. The door shut softly behind me, the sound too polite for what had just happened. The driveway stretched ahead, familiar and suddenly hostile, like a path I'd walked 1,000 times that had transformed into foreign territory. I stood there longer than I meant to, keys clenched in my palm, heart pounding like it wanted answers my family wouldn't give me. I had built something real, something profitable, something respected. And they had erased me in my childhood living room with a single sentence and a folder. The same room where I'd shown my father my first business plan on notebook paper when I was 23. The same couch where I'd celebrated our first major client, champagne in plastic cups. All of it meant nothing now. That night my phone buzzed for the first time. The message came from a client I'd worked with for 5 years. Hey, quick question. Are you still running our account? The text felt like a punch to my stomach. I stared at the screen, pulse racing, hands suddenly cold. They hadn't even announced the change yet. Someone had already leaked it, or maybe word traveled the way it always does in tight business circles. Or maybe Caleb had reached out immediately, trying to establish authority before anyone could question his sudden elevation. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't care, but because something deep in my chest told me to wait, to observe, to let the situation unfold without my interference or explanation. I set my phone face down on the kitchen counter and made tea I didn't drink. The cup sat there getting cold while I stared at nothing. The silence felt heavy with something I couldn't name yet, like the air before a storm. That's when I finally tell you who I am. My name is Bianca Whitaker. For 7 years, I built Whitaker Solutions from a folding desk in my bedroom into a firm with national clients and 7-figure annual revenue. I worked weekends while my friends went to brunches. I fixed disasters at midnight while my boyfriend complained I was married to my phone. I carried the weight when things almost collapsed during the 2020 recession, taking no salary for 4 months to keep my team employed. My father provided seed money once, $15,000 that I repaid within 18 months with interest. I provided everything else. The vision, the strategy, the relationships, the late nights when payroll looked impossible and I sold my car to make it work. And yet, when it was time to choose a successor, he chose my younger brother Caleb, because he shared a last name and a Y chromosome. Because sons inherit and daughters assist. This wasn't the first time I'd been asked to step aside. Growing up, Caleb failed forward with spectacular consistency. Missed deadlines became learning experiences. Dropped projects became exploring his options. Failed classes were finding his path. My successes became expectations, barely acknowledged, certainly never celebrated. I was reliable, dependable, invisible. When I graduated top of my business program with 3 job offers, my father said, "Good job," and turned back to his newspaper. When Caleb barely finished his degree 3 years later with a 2.3 GPA, we threw a party with a cake and champagne. Somewhere along the way, my father confused quiet competence with replaceability. He saw my brother's charm and mistook it for leadership. He saw my efficiency and mistook it for submission, for contentment with supporting roles. The clients didn't make that mistake. They knew exactly who answered their 3 a.m. emergency calls. They knew who remembered their daughter's graduation and their company's anniversary and sent thoughtful gifts. The second message arrived the next morning before I'd finished my coffee. Then another by lunch. Then 3 more by evening. Same question phrased different ways. Same confusion rippling through my client base. Did something change? We prefer working with you. Is everything okay? My inbox filled with careful questions that all meant the same thing. What's happening and should we be worried? I answered each one the same way, keeping my response professional and brief. I'm no longer with the firm. I wish you the best moving forward. I didn't redirect them to my personal email. I didn't pitch competing services or hint at future plans. I simply told the truth. Professional, clean, final. Some replied immediately, asking if I was starting something new, if they could follow me wherever I went. Others went quiet, processing what my departure meant for their projects and relationships. I closed my laptop and stared at the wall of my apartment. The truth was starting to cost them already, and we were only on day 2. I heard about Caleb's first week through whispers and carefully worded texts. A former coworker I'd hired and trained reached out on Wednesday. Meetings ran long because he couldn't answer basic questions. Answers were vague when clients pressed for specifics. He talked about vision and disruption and innovation but couldn't explain execution or timelines. He promised deliverables he didn't understand, making commitments without checking if they were possible with our current team and resources. Clients noticed immediately. They'd been trained to expect a certain standard, a certain level of responsiveness and expertise. The polish I'd maintained for 7 years started cracking within days, like paint peeling off a wall in fast forward. I didn't respond to the texts with questions. I didn't ask for details or encourage gossip. I let information come to me without reaching for it, like a river flowing downhill. Stillness felt like power in a way that action never had. One of our biggest clients called me directly on Thursday afternoon. "I hope this isn't inappropriate," Patricia Brennan said carefully, her voice tight with professional awkwardness. "But can we hire you independently?" I closed my eyes and leaned against my kitchen counter, phone pressed to my ear. This wasn't revenge. This wasn't something I'd orchestrated or whispered into existence. This was gravity, the natural consequence of replacing competence with nepotism, of choosing comfort over capability. Patricia had been my client for 4 years. I'd saved her company twice. Once from a PR disaster involving a recalled product, once from a failed launch that I'd helped pivot into their most successful quarter. She didn't owe my father anything. She didn't owe the Whitaker name anything. "I need to think about it," I said quietly, honestly. "I understand completely," she replied. "But Bianca, I need you to know, I trust you. Not a logo. Not a company name. You." After we hung up, I sat in silence for 20 minutes, watching the afternoon light change across my living room floor. Then I opened my laptop and started a document called Next Steps. I returned to my parents' house the following Sunday for our weekly family dinner, a tradition my mother insisted on maintaining no matter what. My father bragged about Caleb's leadership potential, about how fresh perspectives would take the company to new heights. My brother basked in it like a cat in sunshine, nodding along like he'd earned every word of praise through years of hard work instead of 7 months of barely showing up. No one mentioned revenue. No one mentioned the clients who'd gone silent or the proposals sitting unanswered. No one mentioned me sitting at the end of the table, pushing pasta around my plate, present but invisible as always. My mother asked about my week in that bright, determined way she had. I said it was fine, that I was exploring options. She didn't push. She never did. I left before dessert, claiming early meetings Monday morning that didn't exist. My father didn't walk me out. He was too busy telling Caleb about the strategic planning session next month. Payroll concerns came up the following Monday morning, according to my sources. One client quietly exited their contract on Monday, then another on Wednesday. Both cited restructuring and budget concerns in their professional exit emails, but the timing told the real story to anyone paying attention. These were clients I'd personally brought in, relationships I'd built over years of consistent delivery. My father blamed market conditions and economic uncertainty. Caleb blamed transition friction, like it was whether they just had to wait out a temporary storm that would pass. Neither blamed the decision that caused it. Neither questioned whether replacing me had been a mistake. I learned all this from the bookkeeper who'd worked with me since year 2, a woman named Beverly who'd become something like a friend. She texted me Tuesday afternoon with updates, careful and coded. Things are getting tense. 2 exits this week. Questions being asked. I replied with a simple acknowledgement, nothing that could be screenshot or forwarded. The business email forwarded me something interesting Wednesday night, sent from a client who trusted me. A client forwarded a proposal Caleb had sent them that afternoon. It was sloppy in ways that made me physically uncomfortable. Confusing. The formatting was inconsistent, switching between fonts and styles like he'd copied and pasted from 3 different templates. The numbers didn't match the scope of work. The timeline was impossible. He'd promised deliverables we'd never offered before, things that would require hiring specialists we didn't have and expertise we'd never claimed. Can you explain what he means here? They asked, attaching the document with a tone of barely concealed alarm. I responded within an hour with clarity and honesty. No bitterness. No commentary about my brother or the family situation. Just competence. I broke down what they actually needed, what was realistic given their budget and timeline, what approach made sense based on their industry and goals. I didn't charge for the consultation. I didn't ask for anything in return. The contract came with my response 3 days later, a formal request to hire me as an independent consultant. They decided they couldn't trust Whitaker Solutions anymore. Former employees started texting me throughout November with increasing frequency and desperation. We miss you. It's not the same without your leadership. He doesn't listen to anyone's input. One of my best project managers, a woman named Vanessa who I'd mentored for 3 years, said Caleb had dismissed her concerns about an impossible deadline, then blamed her publicly when the client complained. Another said he'd cancelled the weekly team meetings I'd established, claiming they were a waste of time, then wondered why projects weren't coordinating properly. I didn't encourage them to leave. I didn't discourage them from staying. I stayed still, neutral, present but not pushing or pulling. I was a witness, not a participant. Stillness is terrifying to people who expect control, who are used to others reacting to their actions. My father had expected me to fight for my position or fade into silence and obscurity. Instead, I simply existed outside his reach, building my own foundation. That unsettled him more than anger or tears ever would have. My father cornered me in the kitchen during Thanksgiving dinner, blocking my path to the dining room where the rest of the family was gathering. "You're undermining us," he said quietly, his voice low and angry. I met his eyes calmly, keeping my expression neutral. I haven't said a word. It was true. I hadn't badmouthed the company to anyone, hadn't contacted clients first, hadn't recruited employees or sabotaged projects. I'd simply existed, doing good work when people asked me. He didn't like that answer. He wanted me to be doing something wrong, something he could point to and say, "See? This is why we made the right choice." He needed me to be vindictive or bitter so he could justify his decision to himself and others. Instead, I was simply being good at what I did, and that was somehow worse. Clients are asking for you specifically, he said. That's not undermining. That's consequences. His jaw tightened. Numbers don't lie, even when people do. The December financial review was apparently brutal, according to Beverly, who sat in on the meeting. Cash flow had dipped 20% in October, then 30% in November. Revenue projections for December looked even worse. My father started asking questions he should have asked months earlier. Questions I'd answered 1,000 times when I was running things. Why were renewals down? Why were 3 major proposals rejected? Why had billable hours dropped 15%? Why were clients suddenly unresponsive? Caleb avoided the direct questions with talk about market adjustments and seasonal fluctuations and strategic repositioning. But my father had run this business for 30 years before handing it to me, then to Caleb. He knew the difference between external factors and internal collapse. He knew what decline looked like. The bookkeeper told me he'd requested files going back to my last quarter in charge, pulling reports and spreadsheets, comparing numbers, measuring performance, realizing what he'd lost. And then came the request that I'd been halfway expecting. Can you help stabilize things? My father asked when he called me mid-December. His voice careful. Not apologize. Not admit he'd been wrong. Not acknowledge that removing me had been a catastrophic mistake. Help. Like I was a consultant he could hire to fix his problem without acknowledging it as his mistake. Like I was a tool he could pick up and put down at will. I took a breath, staring out my apartment window at the city lights, at the life I was building beyond his control. I don't work there anymore. The words felt powerful in my mouth. Silence hit the line like a dropped plate, sharp and sudden. Bianca, this is still the family business, he said finally. Then the family should run it, I said quietly. I'm not family when it's convenient and an employee when it's not. I hung up before he could respond, before he could argue or guilt or manipulate. My hands were shaking, but my voice had been steady. That was what mattered. A former client offered to fund my new firm in early January. Office space in a good building. Staffing budget for 3 people to start. Contracts already lined up from 3 companies who'd left Whitaker Solutions and were waiting for me to land somewhere. We've been waiting for you to do this, she said during our coffee meeting downtown. Half the industry knows what happened. They know your father chose your brother. They're ready to follow you wherever you go. I sat with that offer for a week, turning it over in my mind like a stone. Starting my own firm felt like declaring war, like burning a bridge I could never rebuild. But staying still felt like surrender, like accepting that I was only worth what my father decided to give me. I finally said yes on January 15th, signing papers in a conference room that smelled like new carpet and possibility. The announcement went out January 22nd through a simple press release and LinkedIn post. It broke my brother completely. Caleb called that night at almost midnight, frantic and angry. You could have warned me that you were doing this. His voice was high, panicked. Warned him of what exactly? That competence matters in business. That you can't coast on a last name forever. That clients pay for results, not potential or charm. I didn't build this to hurt you, I said, keeping my voice level and calm. I built it because I'm good at what I do. That hasn't changed just because Dad gave you my job. You're destroying the family business, he shouted. No, I said quietly. I'm just not saving it anymore. There's a difference. He hung up without another word. My father called 30 minutes later, and this time, for the first time in months, he actually listened instead of just talking. I didn't think it would happen like this, my father said. His voice sounding older than I'd ever heard it. Tired. Defeated. Neither did I, honestly. But I had prepared without knowing I was preparing. Not for revenge. For survival. For the inevitable moment when being competent and invisible would no longer be enough to sustain me. You taught me to build something sustainable, I told him. To create real value. I did exactly that. You just didn't like that I built it better than you expected a daughter to. There was a long silence on the line. "I was wrong," he finally said. 3 words I'd never heard from him before. I believed him. I could hear the regret in his voice, genuine and raw. That didn't change my answer though. That didn't make me want to come back. I opened my own doors quietly in February. Whitaker Advisory. Name. My rules. My equity. My team. Clients followed faster than I'd expected or planned for. 8 in the first month. 12 by March. We had to lease additional office space by April. Former employees reached out constantly, asking if I was hiring, if there was room for them in what I was building. I was careful, selective, intentional. I built a team of people who'd been overlooked elsewhere, passed over for reasons that had nothing to do with their capabilities. Women passed over for promotions they'd earned. People of color told they weren't ready yet, despite years of excellence. Older workers pushed toward retirement when they had decades of wisdom to offer. We became the firm that saw what others missed, that valued competence over comfort. The old firm couldn't recover from the exodus we created. Employees resigned throughout the spring in a steady stream. Contracts dissolved. Reputation thinned with each missed deadline and confused client interaction, with each dropped ball and unanswered email. The thing my father tried to preserve by keeping it in the family collapsed anyway, faster than anyone expected. The business needed competence, not chromosomes. Needed skill, not legacy. By June, Whitaker Solutions had lost 60% of its revenue. By July, they'd laid off half the staff. Caleb had stepped down in August, claiming he wanted to pursue other opportunities in a face-saving press release that fooled nobody. My father was running it again at 68 years old, working 70-hour weeks, trying to save something that was already gone. He called one last time in late July, and this conversation was different from all the others. I was wrong. 3 words. No qualifications. No excuses. No explanations about market conditions or bad timing. I believed him completely. I could hear it in his voice. The weight of a mistake that cost him the business he'd spent decades building, the legacy he'd wanted to pass down. I thought keeping it in the family meant keeping it with Caleb, he continued slowly. I didn't see that you were the family who'd actually built it into something worth keeping. I know, I said softly, looking out my office window at the city below. Does that change anything? He asked. There was hope in his voice, small and fragile. Thought about it. Really thought. No, I said finally, honestly. But it matters that you said it. It matters that you see it now. That didn't change my answer though. I'd built something new now, something that was mine. Whitaker Solutions shut its doors in September after 43 years in business. No drama. No scandal. Just quiet failure, the kind that happens when pride matters more than performance, when ego trumps evidence. My father sold the client list, what remained of it, to a competitor for pennies on the dollar. Caleb moved to Arizona for a sales job with a tech startup. His LinkedIn carefully reworded to hide the failure. My mother stopped hosting Sunday dinners, the tradition dying with the family business. The family fractured along the same lines my father had drawn when he chose one child's potential over another child's proof. I felt sad about it, genuinely sad. But I didn't feel guilty. I hadn't caused this. I just refused to prevent it. My firm thrived through the fall and into the next year. Not because I took revenge, but because I stopped shrinking myself to fit their expectations of what a daughter should be. I hired 12 people by December. 15 by March. We landed a Fortune 500 client in January that became a case study in our industry. Industry publications featured our growth model and leadership structure. I was invited to speak at conferences about building sustainable businesses and developing overlooked talent. Everything my father had wanted for the family business was happening, just with my name on it instead of his. I passed my childhood home one Saturday in spring without stopping. The lawn needed mowing. The paint was peeling. It looked smaller than I remembered, like childhood places always do. I didn't win by taking anything back. I won by walking away whole, knowing my worth, and never asking permission again. My father had taught me business. He taught me strategy, negotiation, client relations, financial planning. But he'd also taught me, accidentally, painfully, that other people's vision of who you should be will always be smaller than who you actually are. Their limitations aren't yours. Their fears aren't yours. Their need for you to stay small isn't your obligation. I built Whitaker Advisory into something he never imagined possible. Not to prove him wrong, though that was satisfying, but to prove myself right. And in the end, that mattered more than any inheritance ever could. My name on the door. My rules. My team. My life. And every day I chose it again.